Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan and Bobak Hayeri.
Hello, everybody. This is the College Football Survivor Show, where we go deep into the chase for the College Football Playoff Championship. I'm Bobak Hayeri, and I'm joined, as always, by the singular Shehan Jayaraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. You can find us on X at CFB Survivor Show, where you can participate in our polls. Check out our awesome new logo, which you're probably also seeing when you're checking out our podcast. See highlights of the show on our Twitter account or X account, where you can see our lovely faces, and send us feedback. We'd love to hear from you. As always, we always appreciate it when you take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to our show. Reviews on places like Apple always help people find us. So we're really going to just talk about the Heisman ceremony, because the Heisman Trophy ceremony is coming up. It's this Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern on ESPN. We wanted to take a moment to just sort of look at the award, look at the race, and talk a little bit about each of the candidates. So, Shehan, I'll let you lead us off here. What are your impressions right now? I mean, obviously, I should just quickly run down. We got the four finalists: LSU quarterback Jaden Daniels, Washington quarterback Michael Penix Jr., Oregon quarterback Bo Nix, and Ohio State wide receiver Marvin Harrison Jr. What are your initial thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? This is a pretty unique race. Obviously, we had two players who played against each other in the last game of the Pac-12 season last Friday. We also have two players on the list who did not play on Championship Saturday at all. That's a little bit of a rarity. Usually we have just a little bit more, I guess you'd call it title contention or playoff contention, whatever it is. I do feel like a little bit the goalposts get moved whenever, back to the whole SEC conversation, right? In previous years, it's been, got to be competing for the playoff. You got to be competing for a national championship. You got to be doing something special. And we can argue that it may be focused at times a little too much on quarterbacks and playoff teams. But of course, now there isn't an SEC quarterback on a playoff team who makes a lot of sense to name for the Heisman. And that doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter. We shouldn't take into account, playing for a national championship, playing for a playoff. So only one of these four guys played on a team that made the college football playoff. And only one of these players won a conference championship. A little bit of a rarity. Now, I will also say, I don't think there was a home run case this year. We had this happen last year as well, where Caleb Williams put up unbelievable numbers, but Max Duggan wasn't really able to finish that game against Kansas State. They end up losing in the Big 12 championship game. If they win, maybe he's the Heisman Trophy winner. There wasn't a clear and far and away case. Ohio State with CJ Stroud, similar deal. They lose their biggest game of the year against Michigan. They do make the playoff, but still, I think that it's fair to say his case was made off of performance, not off of team success in that kind of way. And so it's a little bit of a unique year to have so many players that are not at that top level. Is that something that bothers you, or is that something that you think makes sense to you?
I have no problem with it, because, it goes down to the classic argument, which you've touched on. Is the Heisman for the best player or the best player on the best team? And I like the ability to kind of isolate not necessarily the team that's going to the national championship, because there's a bit of a flaw there. If someone is the best player, then are they the reason why that team is playing the best? And yes, they contribute certainly a good amount to it, but not always are they, we saw that a little bit with Oregon this past weekend, and with Washington over actually the period of time since the first Oregon-Washington square off, because Michael Penix Jr. wowed us all. Seemed like he had a Heisman moment when he was finishing off the first round of those two teams going against each other. And then the team kind of tripped up a few times, and then the rest of the team was able to make up the difference. So we saw, at times Washington actually does have a good defense. Washington's running game can actually perform when needed. Oregon too. I know were a little bit more skeptical about Bo Nix, and we were kind of having that conversation. Is he really is his efficiency, is his numbers just a product of the totality of the team around him? We look at someone like a Jaden Daniels. because you can compare him to other teams that have had players with multiple, teams with multiple losses that have had solid players. Like, Caleb Williams last year, Lamar Jackson, Tim Tebow, RG3, those guys were just ballers. And they were the reason why those teams had, exceptional seasons, not necessarily championship run seasons, but exceptional seasons on their own. And I think the Pac-12 title game really kind of shook loose some of my own predisposition towards making that mistake of going for the best player on the best team. And not just because Oregon clearly now isn't the best team. Washington, as we said, is the one that's moving forward. I think part of it needs to recognize it is for the most outstanding player. That, I believe, is the only criteria the Heisman voters have to go on. And if we're looking at outstanding players, pound for pound, I'm going towards Jaden Daniels. So that's kind of my thought after I sort of just, and I know we're going to go into more depth in this, but it just kind of brought that bigger question of, does it need to be the best player on the best team, or can it be a player from outside of that? We have to admit there are probably even some players on teams that are even worse that are more outstanding overall. And sometimes, you look at their performance and they go so high in the draft, not just because of, their scouts or just because of how they did on pro day, but because they have been performing excellent the entire season, but to their detriment, the rest of the team is not up to their level. So that is one of those big questions, and it's been an issue, one of the major issues of the award. Obviously, the quarterback thing and the offensive player thing is a whole other question in and of itself. But that is the big thought for me heading into this award ceremony.
Well, I think that's the thing to me, is that I sort of reject this dichotomy of it's the best player on the best team or the best individual player. Because if it was the best individual player, a quarterback is not always the best individual player. Is Cooper Beebe from Kansas State, the offensive guard, a better player at his position than one of the quarterbacks? Maybe. I think that when you look at history, this is not how we look at the award. Both factors come into account. It's the individual brilliance of a player, but it's also the impact on a team, but it's also what the team is, right? Like I think a great example is, well, what kind of impact does Shedeur Sanders have on Colorado? Is he the most impactful individual player? I think that there's some level of argument for that. Obviously not enough of one. They won 4 games. They weren't that good. But I just think that if we go into just taking a step back to this, it brings up the question of, why are we only considering quarterbacks? Why are we only considering players from the power conferences? If we want to ask NFL scouts who the most outstanding players, they're all going to say Caleb Williams. Why is Caleb Williams not a finalist if it's just contextless individual brilliance? I think that that's something to be taken into account. So I understand the thought process. I think that for me, it's a spectrum, right, of these two things. If you are the best player on the best team, that's one thing. If you are the most individually brilliant player, that's another thing. The reality is the Heisman winner is going to be somewhere in between. And each of those things can factor into the case, but I don't think that you have to pick one or the other. And again, we'll get into the actual 4 who made the field, because 4 very deserving finalists. I think that we can say that. And we'll also mention maybe a little later on some of the snubs that maybe could have made it. But let's go ahead and start with the 4 that actually did make it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, let's start with Jaden Daniels, only because it seems like after the week we just saw, despite not playing, he seems to have kind of gone towards the front of the line in some regards. It kind of reminds, to me, it was sort of, people were joking about how, well, in this final year of the Pac-12, look at them having this battle to send a team into the college football playoff. What a great send-off, or what an ironic send-off. But meanwhile, I'm also thinking, now we just watched these two teams clobber each other's Heisman hopes in the process of sending a team to the playoff. Potentially. Who knows? Maybe a bunch of people voted before the championship weekend. We can talk about that towards the end, because that's another issue with the Heisman that's kind of come up. But Jaden Daniels, again, his numbers are incredible. That's certainly the positive for him. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Shehan, and what you think sticks out about him.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and for each of these guys, let's make the case for each of them, whether or not we believe it. I can take Jaden Daniels now. I'll take Michael Penix as well. Why don't you take the other 2 guys, and we'll kind of run through and do that. Okay, so to start off with Jaden Daniels, Jaden Daniels is having the best statistical season by a quarterback. There's no doubt about it. He has more than 1,000 yards rushing. He's top 20 in the country in that stat. He also is top 5 in the country in passing offense as well. You saw what he's done against some pretty good teams. He ran all over Alabama before he got knocked out of that game. 17 touchdowns over his last 3 games. I mean, he hit another level right there at the end of the year. And he did it on an LSU team that, yes, was 9-3, but was 9-3 because of some issues that they had on defense. So he is very much a statistical case. To make a comparison, this is more of a Lamar Jackson case. This is he's just doing crazy stuff, and you almost just have to throw out what happened in the win-loss column because it's just about his individual brilliance. What's your response to that?
Well, if I'm going to take the counter argument and try and argue against Daniels, I would point out that he is supported by some tremendous talent. Malik Neighbors is an elite wide receiver. There's some arguments that he should have also been a Heisman finalist if you're going to have Marvin Harrison Jr. So I will note that, and in addition to Neighbors, who is, again, a Blitnikoff finalist, along with the Dunze and Harrison, we have, he had 86 catches, 1,500 yards, 14 touchdowns. That helps. That makes you look really good as a quarterback when you can throw to somebody as dependable as him, as well as Brian Thomas and Kyrene Lacy. Like, he had weapons that he could use. He had an offense that was tuned to making him look great. And second year in this system with Brian Kelly, obviously he's a transfer, which kind of gets a whole other, because I mean, the 3 quarterbacks are transfers. But, so the question is is he a bit of a product of that system? Because certainly he has talent. But at the same time, he's also piled up statistics against some of the weakest teams out there. I mean, that Georgia State game was off the chart. I remember we talked about it. I'm like, he had 8 touchdowns. Like, that's insanity. So, I mean, yeah, I'm not saying, and not to pick on Georgia State, because they didn't have a terrible season, but I mean, when you're building up stats against some of your weaker opponents, that also kind of calls it into question. And for the incredible numbers, I have actual trouble picking out one play that felt like a Heisman moment. And as dorky as that sounds, that certainly is something where Heisman voters get swayed by. We can think of Heisman moments for so many of the past winners, running backs, quarterbacks. I mean, Desmond Howard set the standard by striking the pose back in the day, and after he scored in the end zone. So those would be probably the weakest parts, because it is piling on an incredible amount of numbers. In addition to, of course, the 3 losses where the offense wasn't totally stymied, but they certainly couldn't maintain it. Like, the interesting juxtaposition to me was that Ole Miss game, which was a firefight. That's one where I'm like, okay, I'm not going to fault him for that, because the offense put up 49 points. What more do you want from them? And then the next week they scored another 49 points. As it turns out, that was enough to beat a very tough Mizzou team that only could score 39 points on their side of the ball. But I think ultimately that might be the thing that harms him, is the fact that this team wasn't quite, it was like a second-tier SEC team. It couldn't, the numbers were great, but against which opponents and in the games that counted could he rise up? Against Alabama, against Florida State. I mean, that whole Florida State thing, I wonder how much the Florida State situation will also be in the minds of voters. Like, you know what? Florida State handed this team, their butts at the beginning of the season. Are we about to give a Heisman Trophy winner to this guy? So I'm trying to get in the mind, the psychology of like, well, no, we should stick with the best player on the best team. And look, Penix, we talked about that. Like, yeah, he kind of dropped off a little bit over the season, but he had some just incredible Heisman moments where he would just sort of put the team and make that key play in a couple of very important games. And again, with Daniels, it's weird to fault someone for that level of insanity in terms of his numbers, but how much of it was the system he was in? How much of it was the talent around him? How much of it really, really came up when it was important?
It's a good question. We'll come back to it. Take us through Bo Nix's case.
Bo Nix, oh my goodness. Well, first of all, and here we get to kind of some fun here, because it reminds me of the recent discussion we had over who deserves to be in the 4-team playoff. Is it the most deserving, or is it the best team at the moment? And Bo Nix has the best, you could say, is he the most deserving? He certainly had one of the best stories. The whole process of going from Auburn to Oregon and building an ability to play, the efficiency he created, the incredible completion percentages. He only ranked behind Daniels in terms of passing efficiency, consistently at the top of all the quarterback categories on a team that was Oregon, say what you want, they were incredible. I mean, we've talked about it before. That first game against Washington, it really seemed like Oregon was the better team. They took some fourth down risks that didn't pay off. Sometimes that happens, and they fell. And of course, the rematch in Las Vegas was a surprise to a lot of us. And maybe are we going to fault Bo Nix for one bad game and not even that awful game? It wasn't like the wheels totally came off. It was just kind of an effort that didn't help push his team over against a very tough team. Both teams, top to bottom, were exceptional. So I look at that. We look at last year. I mean, Caleb Williams, right before the Heisman Trophy ceremony, he lost to, he kind of got a little dinged up against Utah, and the Trojans totally collapsed in the Pac-12 title game last year. So, if we're going to think of that, consistently before that game, he's been exceptional. One bad game, it's hard for me to want to just toss him out just for one bad performance, because he's had great numbers, not the insanity levels of Jaden Daniels, but he's also had a more well-rounded team around him. They do have a running game. They do have a good defense. So I think that would be my push for him. Not only is he's one of the best players he's the best player on his team, but I think consistency has been there, and just one bad performance should not negate all of those games before it.
Yeah, so the case against would be in some ways, this reminds me of the college football playoff race. We have a relative head-to-head situation, and head-to-head is not necessarily something that should be decisive in a Heisman race, certainly, but Bo Nix was outplayed in both games against Washington and Michael Penix Jr., and it was the passing game that ended up being the difference in Washington winning both of those games. So it's hard for me to say that he deserves to be on that level. Now, the other part of it too, and I think that this is, to me, a little bit more of the compelling case against Bo Nix, outside of course, again, the Penix thing, is he is so far behind those other two guys in average depth of targets. He was throwing the ball on average for 7 yards per attempt downfield. When you look at Michael Penix Jr., he's close to 12 yards per attempt downfield. Now, what does that mean? It means that when you look at a high completion percentage for Bo Nix and a middling, relatively speaking, completion percentage for Michael Penix Jr., and even a more middling one for Jaden Daniels, although obviously his was better than Penix, they're not being asked to do the same things. They're just not. And being able to do things efficiently and effectively is a positive, but so much of what Oregon did was after the catch, and was because they let guys like Troy Franklin create opportunities. The other thing I'll mention too is, I think that a big part of the Bo Nix case as well was, this might be the best team in the country. And you look around their team right now, right? And you compare them to Washington, and even if we want to, say Ohio State with Marvin Harrison Jr. and Washington with Michael Penix, and LSU with Jaden Daniels, you look at their running game. Which team out of those four has the best running game? It's Oregon. Which of those teams has the best defense? It's Oregon. Which of those teams has the best coordinators? I think that people would have said Oregon heading into the Pac-12 championship game. So he has so much more to work with than any of these other Heisman contenders. And so for me, it's just context, right? That doesn't eliminate him for me, but if you've been given a lot, I'm going to be asking of you a lot. And he did a lot of it, but I can't compare him to those other guys. With that said, let's move on to Michael Penix. So Michael Penix, I don't think it's a secret that I've been a big fan of his all year long. So he came out of the gates absolutely torching college football. He was putting up 400 yards and 4 touchdowns in every single game. And after the Washington game, the stats stagnated a little bit. I want to be clear, though. He is still top 5 nationally in passing yards. He's still top 5 nationally in passing touchdowns. But I think that because of that, we assumed that he was making a Lamar Jackson case, that he was making a stats only case. But if you watch Washington all year long, when they have needed a play to keep this winning streak going, Michael Penix Jr. is the guy who makes that play. The first Oregon game is the perfect example. There have been a shortage of quote unquote Heisman moments this year. By far, the best one was Michael Penix Jr. going on an insane 2-play drive against Oregon's defense to score a touchdown and win the game. There's been no better moment, maybe by an individual player this year in college football. The other thing, too, is I'll go back to the Pac 12 championship game. His stats were pretty middling from that game. I think he was at mid 260s in yardage, a touchdown and interception. But everyone who watched that game should understand how this Washington team works. They got out to a lead because Michael Penix Jr. is brilliant and because he puts the ball right where his receivers can get it. And he's not going to be the one who finishes all of these drives. There were plays and there were moments where they gave the ball to their running backs in the red zone when maybe it could have been a passing touchdown if they decided to go that direction. And so I think that coming away from it's not just that one game against Oregon or the other game against Oregon, by the way. It's also the ability to convert on third and fourth downs. It's the ability to put together game-winning drives, to put together game-sealing drives. I think it was the Oregon State game, right, where he had the play where he has an option to either take it and go quarterback sneak or pull it and go around. And that was the game-deciding play. That he converted a fourth down with his savviness. And we saw that a little bit more down the stretch. Now, again, his numbers do not match up to Jayden Daniels because of Jayden Daniels' rushing yardage. But if you're talking about a guy who played the quarterback position at an elite level, who has made every single play to win games, to play the most winning football out of anybody on this list by far, he's keyed a 20-game winning streak for Washington. They've beaten Oregon 3 times over that time period. They've beaten Texas. They've beaten Oregon State twice. This is an incredible player. This is individual brilliance. And I think that he doesn't just meet the case for best player on the best team. I think that he has also had an individually brilliant year as well.
He is an interesting story and an interesting candidate. My concerns are, did he have, and I wouldn't, misfortune is such a strong word, but did he unfortunately peak a little too early in the season? Because I mean, that they were just ready to hand it to him after that first Oregon game, most certainly. And then his performance since, again, he's managed to get the team to win games. I'm now not doubting that at all. He's surrounded by some solid talent. There have been games where, again, as we talked, the defense had to step up against USC. The running game really stepped up. And he's got some extremely good wide receivers, Rome Odunze being the leader of that group, also Blitnikoff finalist. So to some extent, is that also part of the question that we had with Jayden Daniels? Like, is he surrounded by strong talent that helps make him look even better? But at the same time, because I mean, certainly he's had moments, and I don't want to doubt, I 100% agree. Of all 4 candidates, he's had the most Heisman-worthy moments kind of interdispersed. That Oregon State, where he handed off to Odunze, who was the one who actually made those were those great moments, and we can kind of point at those. My only concern is the kind of drop off in overall performance. The completion rate in November dropped below 60%, was happening at the same time Jayden Daniels was putting up incredible numbers. I mean, Jayden Daniels, we've talked about his passing. The guy's running, right? He's in like the top 25 in most of the rushing categories as well against, I was struck. He was ahead of, he was tied with Jonathan Brooks with touchdowns, such rushing touchdowns and things like that. So I look at him as more, if we're talking about, quarterbacks on teams that have talent around them, Jayden Daniels is able to make it up also even as a rusher in addition to a passer. So you can say he's got talent around him, but he could run and he can pass. With Penix, it's like he has those moments. And this is also kind of, as we've said at the outset, this isn't a year where one player was running away with it. We thought halfway through it might be Penix. And now this kind of blurriness that's occurred, I think has overall damaged his candidacy in a way that the Pac-12 title game, if he had absolutely played lights out, I think would have pushed him over. It would have pushed Bo Nix, who had seemed to be the presumptive leader, would have not only fallen behind, but everyone watching that Friday night game would have gone like, "Oh, it's Penix. We forgot all about him. We started not giving him the credit he deserved, but he also didn't have a performance that stuck out to the level, and it stinks. Again, it's the whole reason I said why Nix shouldn't necessarily be dinged for one bad performance, but that was also the opportunity. It is a beauty contest. It really is. I mean, because part of the problem is, if we're going back to the whole like winning team thing, the winning teams are the teams that get the most voters watching it. They've got like 900 something voters. They pay attention to the teams that are doing the best. So when they're asked to name their their three top candidates, they're going to name the candidates they see more often. So all of that said, I think the biggest concerns I have for Penix are the fact that he kind of, the second half of the season, while he had some bright spots in it, a lot of players have bright spots in it, it doesn't have the consistency, and it doesn't have necessarily the push that we saw from Daniels, and that I think will ultimately not help him get the Heisman Trophy this season. So that leaves us.
I do have issue with something that you said, but we'll address it in the next segment. First, let's close out this first segment with Marvin Harrison Jr.
No problem. So we have one last player that we should absolutely mention, Marvin Harrison Jr. And he is the one non-quarterback, which only tells you he's exceptional at his position, but he is absolutely a talent up and down. Every game that people have seen Marvin Harrison play for Ohio State this year, he has stolen the show. I mean, he is the reason, arguably, why they beat Penn State in that slugfest earlier this season. Even if he has a game where he isn't getting the numbers, it's because he's being absolutely covered by the team, which opens up the other receivers. A lot has been said about the quarterback that's been throwing to him. No disrespect to Kyle McCord, who may not even be with Ohio State next year. Clearly, the issues there had nothing to do with the receiver. The talent that he performs, he's also got a really catchy slogan, "Here comes the sun," kind of going on the because his father was also an exceptional player. But he's put up great numbers. He's the favorite to win the Biletnikoff. He has had his best games were against the toughest opponents, Penn State and Michigan. When needed, he performs at a level that is beyond the others. And if we are talking about the most outstanding player, if we're really honing in on that, all three of those quarterbacks we just mentioned have flaws. They aren't complete, unquestioned winners in every respect. We can pick and nitpick them pretty well. With Marvin Harrison Jr., we have the complete package of a star, a NFL future. I mean, all these guys have NFL futures, but this guy, he's just going to be plopped right in, and it's going to be probably off to the races the moment he gets into the league. If we're looking at all, and obviously the Heisman is not a most likely to succeed, high school yearbook, like most likely to be a great NFL player. But he's got that too. And I think if we're looking at raw talent, raw ability, who's put it all together on the field again and again and again, it's Marvin Harrison Jr.
Yeah, he was my pick before the season as the potential Heisman Trophy winner. It unfortunately did not go quite to plan for reasons that, like you said, were largely outside of his control. I think that when you talk about receivers winning the Heisman, you have to make the comparison to Devontae Smith. And the numbers, of course, aren't close. Not Marvin Harrison Jr.'s fault. You said no disrespect to Kyle McCord. A little disrespect to Kyle McCord. But I think that Ohio State's passing offense was not all that good this year. Not because of Marvin Harrison Jr., but it does factor in what you're actually able to do. In fact, we put out our CBS Sports All-America team today, and there were only 2 unanimous selections to the list. Ollie Gordon from Oklahoma State and Joe Alt from Notre Dame. And Marvin Harrison Jr. was not our consensus wide receiver 1. Malik Neighbors got more votes than him, and Marvin Harrison Jr. pulled into a tie with Rome Odunze. So thankfully, all 3 were able to make it. These are the 3 best receivers in the country, of course. But he was not even a consensus number 1 on our wide receiver list. Again, for reasons that were not his fault, but it's real. And then again, you start having to ask the questions about, team success and big moments. And obviously he was good against Michigan, was not great against Michigan Like, and this is why the award does become quarterback focused, is because I'm having to qualify every statement with because of reasons outside of his control. That's always going to be the hard parts of being a non-quarterback, and to some extent a running back. You're at least given the ball a little more. But as a receiver, you are dependent to a large extent on what's happening outside of yourself on your team. And that really hurts Marvin Harrison Jr.'s case.
Yeah, I can't argue that. That's actually one of the toughest things to read about. It's like everyone agrees his talent is there. It's just he doesn't get the opportunity to show it off, which, ultimately, I'm pretty sure he's happy that the team would win. He would probably trade that for wins, and of course, didn't happen with Michigan, but not entirely his fault as well. So next, I think we'll take a second and talk about who we think should win the Heisman, as well as perhaps some of the folks who also deserved a trip to New York. Next on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so we've now discussed the top four or the final four candidates for the Heisman Trophy. Now let's get a little bit into who we think is going to win. And just to initially kind of to remind people the process for voting for the Heisman, there's about 929 voters in the Heisman race. They comprise media votes kind of divided into 6 regions across the country. One vote from all the 57 previous living winners, and 1 fan vote. Each voter gets an opportunity to list their first, second, and third Heisman choices on their ballot. And all first choice votes get 3 points. Second choice votes get 2 points. Third choice votes gets 1 point. Once all the ballots have been tabulated, the top 4 are named the finalists, who we now know. They get invited to New York City for Heisman Trophy weekend, kind of some entertainment, they get to get a picture in front of Times Square. They get, they deserve it. They absolutely deserve it. Then they announce in the ceremony the player who actually won it all. All of that said, Shehan, what's your thoughts? How would you like to start this conversation?
So I want to start with this. So we talked about it can be a most brilliant individual player award. It can be, potentially a best player on a best team award. If Jaden Daniels was putting up the season at somewhere other than LSU, is it talked about this way? Like, are we talking about this way if it's not at LSU in the SEC?
You actually opened up a really interesting thought. If he was at another program, not an LSU, not
if
a
he was
top
at Arizona
program,
State.
Well, I know that. So that's where I'm going. His performance would mean he is a top transfer, a portal target. That's what would happen. It would be like the Portal King Award. Like, oh, wow, look at that player. They had a great season at, and it's scary. Like that other P5 program where it used to be like G5, FCS, we're looking at other spots for folks who are just balling out. But like, if he was at another program, perhaps that would be what we were talking about. As we said, all 3 of these quarterback finalists are transfers. I mean, don't get me wrong. Auburn could have certainly generated a Heisman candidacy for Bo Nix. It just didn't click there. And Penix in Indiana was certainly plausible. It just they found spots that they could go. And as we said, Arizona State for Jaden. So that's a fascinating question. I think had he been at some of these other programs, because I mean we've looked at some of these performances, especially when Arizona switched quarterbacks, and we saw, the quarterback play over at Liberty. Obviously, we know who's coming out of Coastal Carolina. We know all these guys who've had histories where they've put some incredible stats up. They don't get into the Heisman race. They just get attention and maybe a conference, all conference award. And then they get rewarded by, at this point, I guess, a really sweet NIL deal. But that's a great point. I mean, is that what it is? Heisman is really now is this like, are we taking this whole concept of we're now separating divisions? We're creating this new division above the rest in the NCAA. Is that now also mean that the Heisman will go be the winner of that particular group, and then the rest you get, the Portal Award or something like that? They'll come up with something, something cute, or I'm sure it'll be like, sponsored by Coke, the Coca-Cola Award or something for team player most likely to be borrowed by or stolen by one of the other programs. Man, is that the future? Did we just predict the future? I don't know.
I sure hope not. So here's what I'll say to this, right? I want to be clear. I think that if any of these 4 players won the award, like, I don't think you can be that mad about it. Again, there's no surefire guarantee. There's not 2019 Joe Burrow walking through here, right? There is no obvious consensus pick. It does come down to subjectivity. I think that, and this is probably reactionary on my part, so I want to break this down for myself a little bit. I think that there is this feeling, as somebody who watches national college football, who watched, by the way, Jade Daniels play at Arizona State for a while and saw him be pretty good. And by the way, then transfer and everybody be like, all the LSU fans be like, oh, he's not even that good. And of course he's good. He just was playing at Arizona State. So one thing that you said that I disagreed with was that, well, when teams are good, people watch them and then they want to vote for those players. I actually think this is the opposite case. I think that the good team, being Washington, gets much less attention than the team that people watch, which is LSU. People got to see Jaden Daniels put up these crazy numbers and have these big performances because I think more voters watch LSU than watch good teams. And so does that mean that Michael Penix Jr. Has to win the award? No. But when you look at that middle and latter half of the season especially, and like we said, one of the biggest plays that Michael Penix made all season was pulling a handoff, right? Like that was one of the biggest plays that he made all season long. That's not showing up in a box score anywhere. But how many people, and when you have, again, it's 900 plus voters. This is a legacy thing. I mean, there's a lot of people who have ballots who no longer even cover college football or don't watch it consistent. Like, it's something to take into account. So narrative does drive this award to a large extent, which I don't have a problem with. It's just context to understand the award. But I mean, how much, especially when people are like, Michael Penix Jr. should be, whatever it is, minus 1,600 odds or whatever it was. I don't even know if I did the plus minus right. I'm not a gambler. But whenever you have something like that, like how much of it is, well, people were only watching Michael Penix's box scores and not even really watching him play.
You brought up an interesting question, because are more people watching an LSU because of obviously the tradition of watching the SEC? I mean, is it because are people ignoring Washington because they're doing great, or is it because some of their earlier games just weren't particularly compelling matchups? It wasn't quite the level of Michigan's regular season up until the very end, but it was still a pretty dull affair up until they played Oregon for the most part. And how much of that was also how hard it was to watch some of these games? I mean, Pac-12 Network did exist this season, and some of those games were late at night. That to some extent people thought that benefited Penix, that not many people were probably up late watching that Arizona State game. It's interesting because, I mean, you've also brought into the whole question of, is there inherent bias towards the programs that get typically the most eyeballs, which are the LSUs and the SEC. In the Pac-12, you might argue USC and to a lesser extent Oregon and Washington fall into that category, while the Big Ten has a much easier argument talking about the fact that more people want to see Ohio State play, more people want to see Michigan play, and then Notre Dame, of course, has to be thrown into that conversation as well. I wonder if that's part of it too. If we get more people watching LSU, it's because the sheer number of people and the college football fandom certainly seems to center towards the South. And how much of that weighs into it and also goes towards benefiting someone like Daniels playing at LSU. I do wonder about that, and how much of it comes into play and how much of it is momentum. Because if you have a lot of voters and they're not really paying attention to the season that much, they might also kind of go like, oh, that makes sense. The SEC is always tough. That guy's got great stats. And they might not realize the Pac-12 was arguably the best conference this season.
Oh, and I don't think that there was any question that Washington's schedule was significantly harder than LSU's this year. They had to play multiple games against top 10, top 15 teams. And even, by the way, one of the games that Michael Penix was dinged for was not being awesome against Arizona. Well, Arizona ended up being a top 15 team. We didn't go back and reevaluate that either. Now, another thing I want to mention too, because I don't just want to say on this one thing. So Jaden Daniels, again, having a fantastic historic type year. I will say, in 2023, he leads the nation in total offense right now by a pretty good margin. He's averaging 412 yards of offense per game. In 2021, Brennan Armstrong at Virginia averaged 427, right? We didn't talk about him in that kind of way at all. Now, there were systemic stuff, right? Like he played as part of a Virginia system that made a lot of sense, that really fit his needs. It was kind of like a perfect storm of things in some ways. And he was unfortunately unable to replicate that heading forward. He went to NC State this year, didn't really play very well. But like, I didn't see very many people say, well, I mean, you look at Brennan Armstrong. Actually, Bailey Zappi also put up 427 yards a year. And Bailey Zappi has started in the NFL now also, by the way, which, so this was not just a player just beating up on bad competition. This was also a good football player who's going to stick around the NFL for a little while. But like, in Western Kentucky's not LSU. I don't want to sit here and pretend that it is. But if numbers are just everything and it doesn't matter and all, well, it just, then how does it keep coming back to these same programs if every criteria at the end of it seems to end with the same answer, which is Greg Sankey saying, well, we're different. It's Sesame Street. So look how impressive it is. We're the SEC, so you should take it seriously. When that argument never extends out. And I do want to try to address that own bias within myself, because I do think that I have a reactionary quality to that. To, you're trying to tell me that what I'm seeing is the greatest thing ever, and I'm not sure. I think Jaden Daniels had an incredible year. I will say, just to, and I've more questions, but I will say between you and me, it is solely between Daniels and Penix for me. I think I could go either direction on it. I think that Penix's case to me goes so much further than just being a good player on a good team. I think that he's an impactful player and is one of the reasons that it's a good team. And I think that leads us into this question from me, which is, like, from a scale from 1 to 10, how much, if at all, does team success play in your perception of who should win the Heisman Trophy?
Well, I think, especially when we're looking at a quarterback, team success does have a big thing to do with it. Only because the offense is captained by that guy. He's the leader, the field commander, however you want to say it. So it does have an impact. And typically, it's rare to have a quarterback that's so incredible despite a losing program. I mean, we're not like, there's that one Notre Dame quarterback way back in the day who won on a losing team. We're going to set that aberration completely aside. So I think that part, yeah, you have to have a winning program, particularly if you're an offensive player, which of course brings up the whole, like, well, this has never been a defensive player award. So inherently it's going to go towards teams that tend to win and teams that tend to put up points overall. I agree with your assessment of both players. I think it has come down to Daniels versus Penix. And I think if you look at the leadership qualities, Penix seems to be the one that has the edge. He has that ability, that intangible factor, that ability to make that call to hand off the ball in a critical situation against Oregon State, that ability to make plays where needed and to just keep the whole team on track. So much of that is just I mean, I don't want to say motivation is a quality that you necessarily vote for a Heisman, but he's clearly able to keep that team in games. And if your quarterback starts to fall apart, that is not going to help the rest of the team. I mean, they are the leader on the field in so many ways. Daniels is just a machine in terms of what he's put up. So I can see the votes going in either direction. And this is going to be tough. I think now Daniels will probably win, because I think there will be a bit of just sort of, well, the numbers are just, the numbers are so incredible that people would rather just go with that. And perhaps they have some memories of some of the games where people are like, wow, Penix had a down game. Even though they would win, they would just hear like, oh, he isn't quite what he was after Oregon. That was pervasive in November. And I could see that also sitting in back of voters' heads to the point where they're also hearing, meanwhile, it is so much a race. I mean, we all get the emails. If you ever covered any sport, any level of college football, you start getting all the emails for all of these guys. And you start hearing all of the PR push to try and get them. And most press obviously try to keep that out of their head, other than the cute, phrases like, here comes the sun, like obviously was stuck in my head. But I mean, and meanwhile, look at me. I'm like, it's nice that Harrison got, a finalist, but I don't think he has any credible shot whatsoever. So ultimately, I think Daniels is probably going to win, only based on the fact that storylines make a difference. And with this many Heisman voters, some of which, as we've said, probably aren't paying super close attention, if they get any bit of information over the last however many weeks, or if they're just waking up from whatever sport they actually are covering and looking at the latest headlines, they're probably going to go with Daniels. That's my thought.
But to go back to the question, though, I mean, how much do you value winning in deciding a Heisman vote? Like, do you think that for you individually, how much do you value that?
Well, I would say the team has to consistently win. I'm not saying they have to be a national championship contender. 8 or 9 wins at the very minimum, because otherwise then it just tells me something's off. Unless we have, I suppose, and it depends on competition, to be clear. So again, look at my inherent bias coming up. I'm assuming that a player is going to be better because they're playing against a P5 or soon to be P4 conference, a P4 opponent, overall. So, and I mean, that's no lie. I mean, that's been a part of analyzing players forever. So, I mean, I would like to see a player on a program with challenging opponents. So if they are losing, the quality of opponent comes into play. And if they're losing, it's not because the quarterback or the running back just has bombs a particular game. It's because the other team is also scoring a lot of points. Like, sort of, if we're going to Daniels, like that Ole Miss game, Ole Miss managed to win, but my goodness, 55-49. You ain't blaming the offense for that one. So again, I think part of it has to do with, you want to see a consistent winner. And if there are losses, you want to be able to say, well, it certainly wasn't at the expense of the person who is the making the race for their candidacy for one of these awards, the Heisman, the Blitnikoff, or anything. You want to say, like, in taking them in a vacuum, their performance is excellent.
So for me, I do think that elevating a program has to be part of my consideration. And I think that's one of the things that makes me so hesitant on Daniels, is that LSU in some ways had a bad year for what LSU is. They went 9-3. They ultimately were not competitive for the SEC West. They lost 2 games in their own division. They lost by 3 touchdowns against the one truly special team that they played. And LSU was picked as a top 5 preseason team. This was the team that was supposed to win the SEC West and potentially the SEC. Now, we can say that the defense was a huge part of why they had issues. But, I mean, as somebody who covered the Big 12 in the 2010s as well, I also know that playing a ton of super productive offense makes a defense's job harder. We evaluate that differently for other places than we do for here, right? We're like, well, maybe their defense is just bad because they're playing, in the SEC or whatever. I mean, some of it is how you also control the game. It's also how, when you run an explosive offense, it's harder to play defense. So I think that for me, you don't have to win the national championship to be Heisman caliber to me.
Could I ask you a quick question? So would Caden Salter be someone you would consider as a Heisman candidate in that sense? Because he's had stellar numbers, performed extremely well with the Liberty schedule, which, was a whole other conversation. Certainly good enough to get him the CFP for the New Year's Six, I should say. But is that someone who then you think should also deserve a harder look by Heisman voters in ranking their top 3?
Totally. So, and I actually think that this leads us into just quickly the conversation of guys who were left out, who should have maybe been considered. And then let's put together our top 3 each at the end for what our individual votes would be. I do think that Caden Salter deserves more consideration for the Heisman. He also, by the way, is a player who is talented. He originally started at Tennessee, had some personal issues, had to leave. So this is not this is a bad player playing a bad schedule. This is a good player who elevated the team. Now, I don't think he necessarily has to win the award. Liberty was a good team last year. They do lots of other things well, too. But I do think that he should be under more consideration for not just the Heisman, but the Davey O'Brien, for the, we talked about him at the Earl Campbell Award, the Texas-based award. He should be under more consideration for not just the Heisman, but other awards. And another team that I'd point to as well is Oklahoma State, right? Oklahoma State had a couple of down years, and Ollie Gordon came in and changed everything for that team. And they lost their 33-7 game because he wasn't in the starting lineup. Once he was inserted into the starting lineup, they finished top 2 in the Big 12 after they hadn't done that in a little while. And obviously, I don't think he should have gotten the Heisman nod. He had his biggest game against Texas. He didn't play very well for, again, we keep going back to it, reasons that weren't his fault necessarily, but it is real. But I do think that he's a player who deserved a little bit more consideration. And to go back to my original point, I do think that elevating a program matters to me. We are seeing Washington put together not just the most impressive stretch that they have in a little while, we're seeing the most impressive stretch since 1991 when Washington won the national championship. And this is a 2-year stretch. This is multiple years of success under this quarterback and this coaching staff. And so to me, the Heisman is a story award. It is a narrative award. Narrative does drive the award. And I think, again, that's a good thing. Where I have issue with it is the narrative only seems to flow one direction. If Jaden Daniels was having this year for Washington in the Pac-12 and Michael Penix was having this year for LSU in the SEC, I think that the result of the award would be different.
You think it would be like a runaway for Jaden Daniels, or you think it would have actually perhaps helped Penix?
If Penix was at LSU having this season, where to be clear, where he's winning close games, where he's making the college football playoff, where he's winning his conference, I think that Penix doesn't run away with it, but I do think that he wins it fairly convincingly. And to be frank, I don't even know if Jaden Daniels, as a 9-3 Washington team, is even a finalist.
Wow, that's an interesting assessment. I don't know if I 100% agree with that, but I like it. I like the thought. It's a thinker.
So for you, who did you think didn't make the list who maybe should have been considered?
We've talked about a few of them. I think Ollie Gordon was a good one. I was a little surprised Jalen Milroe didn't make it with Alabama, not because it's Alabama, but only because we saw the turnaround that the program had when they realized how to use him correctly. And maybe it was too late in the season to draw enough attention towards his performance. But what he did, especially once, they were able to adjust and Tommy Rees made that offense, attuned to him, his passer rating was exceptional. His interceptions went down. He wasn't being sacked as much. And Alabama did what people thought they were going to do. And we saw how bad Alabama, bad relatively speaking, but how down Alabama was originally. So it's not like, it's amazing. We watched them do a couple of tweaks as the season was rolling, and then suddenly Alabama is now this terrifying entity that they sometimes tend to become. And I think part of it was the quality of Jalen Milroe. So, and we've also lightly touched on Malik Neighbors as well. I mean, if we're talking about what makes, his quarterback so great, well, he's an exceptional receiver as well. And again, the Blitnikoff has recognized that ability as well to make him a finalist. So they were also kind of question marks. I thought each of those could have been in there. And I'd be curious to know, how many votes they would have ever gotten to have perhaps not made that final cut, but should have been considered part of it. How about yourself?
Yeah, one other player that I'll mention is the player who I think is most responsible for Texas going from 8-5 to the college football playoff. T'Vondre Sweat, their defensive tackle. Obviously, it is very difficult for a defensive player to win. Something that also hurts him, like it did Jordan Davis for Georgia back in 2021, is he's got a pretty good friend who helps him out in the middle of the line in Byron Murphy II, who's also an elite level player, was named a second team All-American by our CBS Sports team. But T'Vondre Sweat is the freakiest interior rush defender that I've seen in a while. I think that what he's asked to do in this Texas defense is even more impressive than what Jordan Davis was asked to do at Georgia. Like, I think that he is as good a run defender. I'm trying to think of I don't want to go all the way back to like Ndamukong Suh. There's probably been someone since then, but he is really, really good. And his stats don't jump off the page at you, but when you watch Texas play, and we'll have plenty of opportunity to do that before their college football playoff matchup, he dominates games, even without putting up numbers. Teams just run away from him. They played Ollie Gordon, another player who we mentioned as a potential Heisman contender in the Big 12 title game. They tried like 3 times to go up the middle, and they're like, oh boy, we're not doing that. And Texas has a lot of skill position talent, and they played well at times this year, absolutely. And they won them games at times. But the reason straight up that Texas did not lose more games. And the reason that they went 12-1 was because T'Vondre Sweat and that interior defensive line. I'll mention too, the one game they lost was the game where Oklahoma was like, we're not challenging that interior defensive line. We're going to the edge. We're running to the edge with Dylan Gabriel because we are running as far as possible from T'Vondre Sweat, and they were able to pull off the victory. So, again, very difficult for a defense player to win the award, exceedingly difficult for a defensive tackle to win the award. Mm-hmm. Probably helps, though, that he scored a notable pop pass touchdown in the Big 12 championship game.
That was delightful, wasn't it? You know, there's two other names I just want to mention in passing, and then maybe if you want, we can delve into one in particular. One was just Caleb Williams did not have the numbers he had last season, but USC was an awful team. I mean, USC somehow went backwards in every other category. So he didn't do as good as what he did last year, but he certainly, as we've talked about it earlier, the NFL scouts certainly like him because the performance they saw was in a situation that was managed to be tougher, which brings a whole bigger question of what we were talking about with the number of wins that you need to sort of get recognized. And 7-5 certainly wasn't enough. But then if we're talking, when you actually start talking about one player, I'm like, one player who has managed to change the very essence of the final stretch of the college football season by his not being able to play. Jordan Travis. I mean, one man quite literally changed the face of the Final Four of the college football playoff. So if we're looking at sheer impact, that one individual player, how outstanding must you be that your team going undefeated just got yanked out of the Final Four? Like you were already in the top four, but no, they decided, you know, it's still not the same team. Jordan Travis absolutely made Florida State. And to me, that says a lot about the quality of his play, what he meant to that team, how outstanding. He was already in the Heisman discussion before the injury. And now to see what has occurred since, I mean, to me, that only underlines that maybe we should have had a little bit longer conversation about whether he should have at least been included in the Heisman Trophy ceremony by nature of votes. I'm not saying like I'm not saying as a pity thing. I mean, like he genuinely earned the spot. Maybe not the winner, but certainly you don't have that kind of an impact. You don't create almost anarchy in the ACC. I mean, imagine that. Like the guy literally, his health absolutely made or completely changed the face of this final year of the 14 playoff and makes like if it wasn't for what happened to him, people would not be, I think, quite as willing to transition to the 12-team playoff next year. It's an amazing impact. And it's one that I just wanted to note because what do you think? Am I crazy for thinking that? I mean, he had an impact. I mean, and he was a good player, and he still is. I mean, I'm not saying he's dead. I mean, it's like Wade Boggs, may he rest in peace. And I mean, like he's still there, but I mean, sorry, that was for those who may wonder where that just came from. That was from Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I tend to be a little meme heavy in my talk, and that is a joke. They keep saying he's dead, and he isn't, and he's quite alive.
I'm pretty sure he shows up at the end of the episode, doesn't he?
Does. That's even better. Yes, he appears as a ghost version of himself.
So I think that it makes a lot of sense. I definitely don't think that I would put Jordan Travis ahead of this group. But part of it is I think that Florida State is perfectly, again, Jordan Travis is a huge part of that team, of course. I obviously think they should have been in the playoff because I don't think he was that entire team. But no, I think that he definitely deserved a lot of consideration. I mean, what he was able to do, he's also one of those like just big play guys, right? Whenever they needed a moment, whenever they needed a play, whenever they needed to put away a game, Jordan Travis was usually the guy who made it happen. Super efficient, 20 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. I mean, to turn over the ball that little, I think was huge. I would have loved to see what he could have done potentially against Florida and Louisville. I think that maybe he could have made his case there. Unfortunately, it didn't end up happening. I will mention briefly, very weird that the number one team in the country didn't even have a guy who really even deserves honorable mention. I mean, JJ McCarthy wasn't very good. Blake Corum had a really good touchdown year, but did not have a yardage year. I mean, Zach Zinter is a really good player. Unfortunately, he's going to be out for the playoff, and only some injuries matter, not others, when you're evaluating playoff teams, is what I've come to learn from the committee. And defensively, they don't have like the Aiden Hutchinson. They don't have like the guy. They're deep everywhere. So It's a little bit of weird quirk. I don't think it really means anything, but Michigan, nobody really on their team probably deserved to be a Heisman finalist.
No, I think you're absolutely right. They've somehow just managed to be even keel, enough of a talent level across the board just to keep winning, and we'll get to see how that compares against Alabama with a couple of stronger, individuals who seem to have a little bit more Heisman potential, at least this season. But
So
can't wait.
With that said, let's do our top three. Okay, so I'll start at number 3. I think Bo Nix is the clear number 3. I think that his case was a head above Marvin Harrison Jr.'s just because of Ohio State's season context and the lack of numbers. But again, between the 3 quarterbacks, he's clearly number 3 to me. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think after that Pac-12 championship game, it really made me step back and then see your light in all of this, because we've had this discussion before. And, while he's been good, I didn't get the moments that for example, separated him from Penix in terms of just that innate leadership skill, that innate magic, if you want to say, that a Heisman winning quarterback can have. And then with Daniels, we get into the whole numbers question. But yeah, I agree. He's my number 3.
All right. So with that said, who is your Heisman Trophy winner?
This season, I'm going with Jaden Daniels. I just am impressed enough by the overall performance, and that, again, when I was sitting down and breaking down some of what he has achieved, it isn't just in the air, it's on the ground. And that's where actually I was starting to parse him away from Penix. I'm like, Penix is a great passer, but he's not like a running threat. He certainly isn't at the level of, when I realized he was right behind Jonathan Brooks in total rushing yards and ahead of Jawar Jordan in rushing yards and ahead of Dylan Johnson. And, more rushing yards per game than Dylan Johnson or Bucky Irving. When I'm looking at the running backs for the other 2 Heisman finalists, I was like, this is just ridiculous. And I mean, I get it. I'm not saying like ridiculous numbers automatically equate to Heisman, but his performance has just been a delight. And because we've talked about it at the beginning, no player has necessarily been so far and beyond the rest that this is just a crowning ceremony. I decided, especially after the Pac-12 title game, that he was my man. How about yourself?
I will go with Jaden Daniels as my number 1. I want to, again, put in not even a protest vote. I just want to put in a protest statement of, please, let's be smart about it when we talk about Penix versus Daniels. Let's not just be dismissive. Michael Penix Jr. is a very deserving Heisman finalist, would have been a very deserving Heisman winner. The narrative around all of it, frankly, makes me disgusted. But this is not Jaden Daniels' fault. Jaden Daniels had an unbelievable season in a year, by the way, where I think you could make the case that not only has he had a brilliant year, I don't think that almost anybody else has had that kind of brilliant year in college football. This has been a really balanced year in a lot of ways in college football, and there's been one spark that sort of stood above the rest of the field. So I'll go with Jaden Daniels as my Heisman winner. I won't feel amazing about it, but I do think that, like, if Jaden Daniels is a 10, Michael Penix is a 9.9, and I don't think anybody else in the country is above an 8. Like, I think that they were really close, really brilliant, and again, I wish that he. I don't want to go as far as saying that that game should be everything. I wish that he had won a big game. Like I wish that the biggest one that he had this year was Missouri, and then they lost their 3 other games against quality opponents, most in pretty bad fashion. So, like, I'm not going to count it completely against him. If we had a better performance from somewhere else, if we had, a 2019 Joe Burrow, if we had any of these guys, like, I think that I would have considered them much more strongly. But the numbers case is just so dominant that I think that it should be Jaden Daniels. And also, by the way, I think it will be Jaden Daniels whenever the envelope is opened at the New York Hilton, I think it is, on Saturday.
Yeah, they moved it out of the Athletic Club years ago. So yeah, wherever they hold it. I've had friends who've gone to it. It's an interesting event. I had a friend who worked for Jostens, and people don't realize people that make the class rings also make the Heisman Trophy. So he was working there. It's based here in the Twin Cities, and he got a chance to go and check it out one year. And he sent me pictures, and there was a lot of people in suits just kind of milling around, which is fun. I mean, it's fun. Don't get me wrong. I'm making it sound like it's a conference. No, it isn't. It's got to be a blast.
Yeah, it's one of the coolest conferences you can go to.
Yeah, I'm excited for all four of those guys. And I hope, regardless of who wins, they have an absolute blast in New York, because they are about to, all four of them have very promising careers ahead of them in the pros. So, which you can't always say each year in the Heisman candidates. So sometimes a candidate well, hopefully that other knee will survive the championship game. There's been a couple where you're just like, a guy limps into the ceremony. I mean, not from injury, but just from sheer wear and tear. And you're just like, this is it. And before NIL. So you're like, this is it. This is the culmination. Maybe they'll get hired to be like an insurance salesman, where people will know the name when they go for their broker. But now at least they're getting also a decent amount of change, regardless of how it works out.
Welcome to Chicago Bears fullback Jordan Lynch from Northern Illinois. Stuff like that.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we get out of here, we didn't prepare for this. I'm springing this on you. If you had to say right now, who is your 2024 Heisman Trophy winner?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd almost want to see which quarterbacks transfer where at this rate before I make that call. I mean, who's Lincoln Riley going to have? Is it going to be Will Howard? So then he'd suddenly get into that race. I mean, but going based on who we have and who's probably going to be back, I think Jalen Milroe would be my presumptive leader going into the preseason. And I think that would be a safe one, because if Alabama now keeps playing the way they're playing, it orients that offense around him. I think he's going to be, first of all, he's going to be able to perform, and we can see he can perform. I mean, 4th and 31, for goodness sake. But he will be the presumptive favorite, and I think he should be the presumptive favorite heading into next season. How about you?
Yeah, I think that's easily the safe choice. I expect that he's going to enter 2024 as the betting favorite. Will Howard at USC, that is a weird sentence, by the way, but that's a conversation for another show.
And it could fall apart. I mean, that's a guess. That's like I just hear he visited there, so I'm like, okay.
I don't see it, if we're being honest. I don't know about that. But again, this is an off-season conversation. Milroe will be the favorite. I think Ollie Gordon will be top 5. But he's going to have to lead the country in rushing by even more next year, most likely. But he's fully capable of doing it. I think that Carson Beck is a little behind the 8 ball, because he kind of has the whole none of this matters unless you win the SEC, right? Like it's kind of the opposite of the Stetson Bennett, where Stetson Bennett, it was like, well, you've done so much, we're going to give you this credibility. It's kind of the opposite with Carson Beck, where it's like, you haven't done anything, you have to prove it to us. So I kind of feel like that'll be a tough case. So to go a little off board, and we don't know where some of these guys are going to end up, like you mentioned, but I think that makes it kind of fun. Give me Cameron Ward as my 2024 Heisman Trophy winner. We've heard conversation. I was like, if you're picking a transfer, we don't know where they're going, if they're going, or if they're just going to the NFL. Cam Ward, if he goes to the right, depending on where he plugs in, he's going to immediately, everyone's going, oh wow, Cam Ward is, yeah, exactly. I was like, when you started even leading, I love it, because when you started your kind of build up to him, like, he's going Cam Ward. There's no way this couldn't be Cam Ward. I love it. So for people who don't know, transfer from Washington State, started his career at Incarnate Word under now North Texas head coach Eric Morris, out of West Columbia, Texas. But that's more for the Dave Campbell Texas football crowd than the national crowd. He's been linked to Ohio State. I think that he might be linked to USC. There's a lot of really good options for him. And when you talk about playmakers, when you talk about guys who are just special with the football in their hands, he's going to have to deal with some of these fumble issues. He's going to have to deal with some of these interception issues, but he's also going to be playing behind a much better offensive line when he's no longer at Washington State. So if you are talking about somebody who I think can elevate a team, and let's just say, for argument's sake, that he ends up at Ohio State. This is not inside information. This is just projection, potentially. And you get to see him work with Carnell Tate and the receivers that this group has. And also, by the way, coming off of a year where Ohio State struggled so much passing the ball, that story writes itself. And so, is it going to be Ohio State? Will it be somebody else? Up in the air, absolutely. But when you talk about a player who's coming back to college football with the most breakout potential in the country next year on a national level, I think that Cameron Ward is your guy.
I think that is a great call. I'm very curious to see where he lands or if he just decides to go pro. But he's absolutely one of those exciting names. And I think, especially if he lands somewhere, we're going to be having a lot more conversation about him in the offseason. I think that's a good point to wrap this one up. I just wanted to thank all of you who listen to us. Want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you get a chance, wherever you hear us, take a second to rate us, like us, subscribe. You know, if you get a chance, please visit us on X, or as it used to be called, Twitter, at CFB Survivor Show, where you can message us, vote for polls that we like to put up, and just participate. We're now putting up more audio video clips of us, and we're going to try and even spread to a few other social media things. We'll let you know as we get to those. I'm Bobak Hayeri. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can always find his work at cbssports.com. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.